Do you need to spend $1 million to live a long and healthy life? In this video, I'm going to break down the top 10 common sense strategies and tips I've been implementing in my life to live as long and as well as I possibly can. Now, the reason I'm making this video is because there is quite a bit of interesting longevity ideas that have been floated around in the biohacking and dietary and nutrition spheres. Things like fasting, caloric restriction, cold plunging, sauna, obscure drug regimens, insane supplement protocols, and expensive medical treatments. And most recently, we've seen the tech millionaire Brian Johnson come out and talk about his extensive regimen. It's great that he's put everything out open source, but I want to talk about strategies that the common person can actually put into place without having to spend massive amount of money and have a full-time medical team, things along these lines, because just like you, that is unreasonable for me. I don't have the money, I don't have the resources to actually support a regimen like that. So here's the things that I am specifically doing on a regular basis to try to increase my lifespan, and not only my lifespan, but also the quality of my life within my lifespan. And there's some elements that I want to talk about there. The general framework with which I'm coming from here is the idea that mitochondrial energy metabolism is central to longevity, that energy is central to longevity and quality of life and physiologic function. So a lot of these strategies are geared around optimizing energetic function and also preserving structure. And the reason I'm talking about preserving structure is because I'm thinking through the lens of Dr. Raymond Peat's hypothesis that energy and structure are interdependent at every level. So the idea is that if we optimize energy production and we also maintain our structure over time, we can actually make sure that we have enough structure, or that we're building structure, so we can funnel or stream more energy through the system. And ultimately, this energy being absolutely essential and central to all processes in life in general, we can allow that to develop, can maintain itself, and continue. The other thing is, in almost all of the chronic diseases that we're seeing, these are the major diseases in the Western world that are actually killing people. We are seeing that this is characterized by a dysfunction of mitochondrial energy metabolism, a corrupting of mitochondrial energy metabolism, whether that's diabetes, whether that's obesity, whether that's heart disease, whether that's cancer, whether that's neurologic diseases. These are all characterized by dysfunction in energy production at the cell. So I think this is a very central piece, and that's why I think optimizing this component from multiple different angles is how we can actually improve our lifespan, improve our health span, and ultimately do it in a way that is relatively common sense and doesn't cost us $1 million. So with that said, let's jump into the first option here, the first strategy. Now, this first strategy actually incorporates multiple strategies, and I think actually a lot of people may have heard of these, but I want to run through them quickly because I think they're important. And this first category is lifestyle choices. So the things we do on a regular basis, I think, are some of the most common sense, basic things that we can implement in our life that oftentimes are almost free, so that we can live a long, healthy life, minimize disease, and reach a ripe old age. Now, the first thing is drinking. I think minimizing alcohol consumption, and I think most people would agree with this, would be helpful to actually extend the lifespan. And the reason why, the alcohol directly damages the liver and directly damages the gastrointestinal tract and allows for endotoxin to leak into the system. And an endotoxin is directly involved with impairing cellular energy metabolism and is also implicated in a variety in almost every single chronic disease. So minimizing alcohol consumption is extremely important. Also, the liver is central to a variety of different processes in the body in terms of energy regulation, providing carbohydrate for the central nervous system, and also for managing the hormonal system. So we do not want to damage the liver over time. The next one is smoking. So this, obviously, most people know this one as well, but smoking directly damages the lungs. It directly damages the vasculature. And then if we can't transport oxygen from the gas exchange at the alveoli of the lungs, and then we also can't transport nutrients and red blood cells carrying oxygen to the tissues, then we cannot optimize our energy metabolism. So we want to make sure our ability to actually take in oxygen and exchange carbon dioxide, and also our ability to transport vital nutrients to the tissues is optimized across our lifespan. So, and I think this is a big one. We see cardiovascular disease is one of the major killers in the Western world. So minimizing smoking is absolutely essential, not to mention the effects of the smoking products on oxidative stress and inflammation and mitochondrial function themselves. So we want to avoid things that are going to block our energy metabolism or impair the delivery of nutrients to our mitochondria and our cells to undergo energy metabolism. The next one is drug use. So a lot of the addictive drugs are directly damaging to the system, and some of them, the routes in which they are delivered, like intravenous injections, can be directly damaging through introduction of infections and viral infections, bacterial infections, whatever those are, that also directly impair energy metabolism and create a chronic inflammatory and oxidative stress state. Plus, the drug use indirectly changes behaviors in a negative way that directly affect energy metabolism. So, for example, some of the drug uses like the opiates or the amphetamines directly destroy the central nervous system over time. They can, if they are being smoked, they're destroying the lungs. If they're being injected, they're destroying the vascular system. And then also they have direct negative effects in terms of maintaining a normal circadian rhythm and sleep structure, maintaining a community structure and having a purpose in life, and also having a positive mindset and outlook, and also managing stress effectively, having a solid diet, these things. So we want to avoid, besides their actual direct toxic effects, we want to avoid them because they have these wide-ranging negative effects across other areas of our lifestyle that are essential to our health. The next one is being excessively sedentary. Now, do I think people need to go out and do 25,000 steps every single day? No, I don't think that that's necessary, but just having general movement, I think actually is important for health overall. And I think a lot of people in the Western world are actually not moving quite a bit. It doesn't have to be this extreme exercise. It doesn't have to be running 5Ks, but just moving around in general, getting up every hour or so, going for a walk here and there. These types of things are important to prevent sedentarism, where we see strong associations with sedentarism and disease processes and things along these lines. So making sure you're just getting general movement. Doesn't have to be excessive exercise. We'll talk about exercise, but just enough to get the blood flowing and to get moving on a regular basis. Now, the next one is circadian rhythm disruption and sleep disruption and night shift. So working late at night or overnight, I've done this myself. It's actually really problematic. It took me quite some time to recover from it. Also, having a disrupted sleep cycle or disrupted circadian rhythm, I think, is directly involved in impairing health span and lifespan in the long run, because the central nervous system and the cells of the body require sleep for the restorative processes in order to clear out metabolites, in order to improve function and recover in general. And if you're not allowing this to happen, you are allowing the accrual and buildup of damage over time and disruption of the hormonal systems that can further lead to damage themselves via the stress hormones. So we want to actually make sure we are sleeping regularly. I think sleep is absolutely essential in this process. And again, this is, I hesitate to say easy because I've disrupted my sleep pretty heavily working night shift, but I think it's not an expensive option to start to get right and implement strategies to improve things. And so this is, for example, adjusting your light exposure. If you live in a northern latitude, you can use things like halogen bulbs, bright halogen bulb spotlight, floodlight in the morning to get yourself that light exposure. You can use red light to improve mitochondrial function directly. The bright light in the morning can improve dopaminergic signaling. And then also it sets eating your meals at a regular time every day can help to set the circadian rhythm, allow you to optimize these processes over time, minimize oxidative stress, minimize stress hormones, and improve metabolism overall. Now, the next one is being overweight. This isn't necessarily the problem. I think when we see people who are, it's more so obesity, is that is indicative of the metabolic dysfunction. But in general, we want to, this doesn't necessarily mean that we want to go and do excessive amounts of exercise and starve ourselves to make sure that we're always at the correct weight. We want to make sure that energy metabolism is working effectively and we are maintaining an appropriate weight, because as we start to gain weight, this would be indicative of impaired energy metabolism overall. So I think you're seeing an association there where people who are dealing with impaired energy metabolism, metabolic dysfunction, are putting on excess weight and reaching obesity. And we want to correct these different states. And that is largely through these different lifestyle components. So maintaining a normal weight is important in actually maintaining normal metabolic function and also having a long, healthy life. The next one, the last one in this category, I think is relatively self-explanatory, but I also think it's something that isn't discussed quite as much. But for young men, getting into accidents or getting injured is a very easy way to shorten your lifespan or destroy your quality of life. And this one is like one of the lowest hanging fruit, to avoid doing problematic and irrational and dangerous things that put you at risk for serious injury. And this one became very apparent to me when I was working in the ICU, and I'm seeing 20-something-year-old guys coming in who hit a tree while they were skiing and now they're paralyzed. Or they rolled their ATV over that they were riding recklessly and they broke their neck and now they're quadriplegics. Or they were riding their bike in the city and they got hit by a car and now they're in a coma and they have traumatic brain injuries and they're not waking up. Or they drug overdosed, had an anoxic brain injury, lack of oxygen to the brain, and now they'll never be the same ever again in their life. Or they jumped off a bridge to commit suicide because their girlfriend broke up with them. These types of things, these types of the sports injuries, getting in fights at bars, getting hit with a bottle in the back of the head, a wine bottle in the back of the head, get a pretty bad brain injury, never the same again. These types of things can be easily avoided. They can maintain quality of life. And a lot of this is risk management in your personal life and not getting involved in these different circumstances that are likely to cause significant injury and significant harm to you. And the reason I signal out guys here is because it's usually young guys who are involved in these circumstances. Can young women get involved in this? Can older people get involved in these types of things? Yes. The general idea overall, the highest risk group was young men, but the general idea overall is to avoid doing extremely dangerous things. I can go on and on. You know, when I was working in Miami, a guy got hit by a boat when he was riding his jet ski, and then it ruptured his liver, ruptured his spleen. He punctured his lungs, all these types of things. Going into injuries like this can be life-altering perpetually. Multiple guys I've seen get in motorcycle accidents, both inside when I was working in New Jersey and also when I was working in Florida. People riding their motorcycles recklessly down to the Keys, and they get in an accident, and there's no coming back a lot of times from those types of accidents. So avoiding dangerous things, I think, is also a great way and a low-cost strategy to actually improve health span and lifespan overall. Now, the second category I want to talk about is the idea of sarcopenia and osteopenia. So sarcopenia and osteopenia are the loss of muscle mass and bone mass with age. It can happen before reaching older ages, but it tends to be associated with older ages. And the way to maintain muscle mass and bone mass is to actually have some type of stimuli on the bone and the muscles, like appropriate resistance exercise or activity on a regular basis, so that you have a signal telling the muscles and bones, hey, let's maintain our structure. Let's maintain our calcium deposition in the bone. Let's maintain the amount of muscle mass that we have on a regular basis. The reason this is so important is as you get older, once you start to lose that muscle mass, as you get sick, that muscle mass serves as a buffer. It serves as a protective component and helps you deal with different metabolic issues as you get older and different disease processes. It's a very large buffer. And then the bone mass is extremely important because a large portion of older adults are dying because they fall, they break their hip, they go into the hospital. And when you get older, as you get older, and I've seen this quite a bit in the hospital, if an older person is bedridden for 1 or 2 weeks in the hospital, coming back from that is extremely difficult many times. It takes weeks to months of rehab, depending on what goes on. And then you're also likely to have issues with lung function because as you're not moving around, you're not inspiring deeply enough, the alveoli of the lungs collapse. If you're in the hospital, you can pick up things like pneumonia. You can pick up infections like C. diff. You can pick up infections like MRSA. And then these things kill elderly people because the immune system is not in such a great spot. So we want to make sure that our muscle tissue and our bone tissue is solid across our lifespan so we can continue to carry out our activities of daily living. We don't lose our general function, our ability to walk, our ability to pick different things up, to cook for ourselves, because once those things start to go, it starts to go downhill. And I've seen this time and time again in my time in the ICU. And the easy way to go about this is set up your diet appropriately so you have adequate protein, you have adequate minerals, you have adequate vitamin, and have regular weight-bearing exercise. You don't have to deadlift 5,000 pounds. You don't have to put a heavy barbell on your back and squat all the way to the floor. Even just going for daily walks, engaging in some type of low risk sport. You could go on hikes. You could do some type of basic exercise activity. You could go to the gym and just do machines. All of these components are able to actually maintain muscle mass and bone mass as you get older and as you age. The other thing I'll say here is that we don't want to do excessive exercise, because excessive exercise can also cause problems, can also cause stress, and will dial into stress. So we're really looking to reap the rewards of exercise in terms of the specific effects, in terms of the mechanical loading and the tension applied to the bones and to the muscles, so that they have a signal to say, hey, we need to maintain the muscle mass and we need to maintain the bone mass. Now, the next one is actually something that I picked up from reading some of the case studies and research on the different blue zone areas. So whether this was the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, the Okinawans, the Sardinians, what we're seeing in these different groups, besides just their diets, is they have a community, they have a positive mindset and outlook on life, and they maintain purpose into the older ages of life. And so I think when we think about health, we tend to think about things from a bottom-up perspective. It's what supplement can I take? How many times do I have to jump in the cold bath per week? Is there a specific drug like rapamycin that's going to make me live forever because of what it does in the rat studies? Is there some new novel exercise routine that I can do with weights on the bottom of the pool, or whatever these different things are? But I think when it comes down to it, we also have to think about top-down processes. So how our mindset, how our belief systems, how our community structure and our resiliency to stress and some driving purpose that we maintain in our life helps to stabilize our physiology directly. And as a personal example, I saw this with my own family, with my dad. When my parents got divorced, it was there's these events in life: divorce, loss of family members, the financial ruin, things like this that are extremely stressful. And so the divorce in my family's life my whole family was extremely stressful, but it was particularly stressful on my dad. And when I saw my dad go through this stress, when he remarried and he had more children, he developed a new purpose again. And this purpose revitalized him. Just having the purpose, having these new goals, these new outcomes, these new people to take care of and move forward with. Because at this point, my siblings and I had already been out of the house. We'd grown up, so it was kind of like my parents' divorce at that point. And after that, my dad, they had divorced, they sold the business. And so now he was kind of like left without this purpose and without this community structure and this family structure that he had before. And when he created a new one, it was revitalizing for him. So I'm not saying that everybody needs to go and do this. This is just a basic example. But I think having a purpose going forward and having a community of people around you that care about you, that you can interact with on a reasonable level, is extremely protective over time. And also the mindset, the outlook at life. When we start to talk about mindset components, when you meet a challenge in life, do you view it as a roadblock, as an impasse, or do you view this as a learning opportunity, as a challenge? These types of things, I think, are very helpful to how you manage stress and how this affects the physiology directly. When we start to look at stress hormones, we start to look at glucocorticoid, we start to look at catecholamines, the perception of an event will change the level of these things. So if you go into, say, for example, you're going into a test, the test can be stressful. But if you're going into the test and you're understanding, even if I don't pass this test, I'm going to learn something in studying for this test, and I can always do it again, and there's a learning opportunity, and I'm getting better at taking tests. Or you go in and I'm prepared for this test. I know what I'm doing. I understand these things. The level of stress is different than somebody who goes in, what if I fail? And if I fail, everything is over. So the way that we frame things to ourselves can be extremely important. As another quick example, when I was working in the ICU during COVID and I was doing the travel contracts, was going to new hospitals, my perception of the events was, this is a great learning opportunity. These are great opportunities for me. Is it stressful? Is it difficult? Yes, it's going to be stressful. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be trying, but I'm going to get quite a bit of experience. I'm getting quite a good opportunity overall, to whether that's financially, whether that's experientially, all these different components. And I'm grateful for this. So I went in with an attitude of gratefulness for the opportunity, which shifted my perception versus somebody else who would go into the into the dynamic and like, I hate this. I don't want to do this. It's so stressful. This is absolutely terrible. And I'm not starting to justify the conditions that were put in place. All I'm saying is I could not change the conditions. They were completely out of my control. So what I could do was shift my perspective so that every day I showed up to work, I was like, yeah, this is difficult. This is hard, but I'm grateful for the opportunity and I'm going to make the best of what's possible. And that actually lowered my stress levels in the process while I was going through that. So these things I think are extremely important and they're often not talked about. It's usually diet and supplements and exercise routines and drugs and things like this. Now, the next one, let's actually get into some of the dietary stuff. So the next category we're going to talk about is the idea of membrane saturation. And what do I mean by membrane saturation? I mean how much polyunsaturated or saturated fats we have inside our mitochondrial and our cell membranes. And basically, there's some work by a researcher. His name is AJ Holbert. There's other researchers on his team. Basically, what they look at and they show is that within a species, the more polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, that are incorporated in the cell membranes and in the mitochondrial membranes, the less the lifespan is, the worse the health outcomes are. And the reason why is the polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-3s and omega-6s, are very unstable. And so what winds up happening is when the idea or the theory is that when the mitochondria produce energy, then they produce a bit of a reactive oxygen species, kind of like a bit of smoke. If you have saturated and monounsaturated fats and less polyunsaturated fats, the membrane structure is actually able to be less likely to be damaged. However, as you start to increase the polyunsaturated fatty acids, you start to see increased damage to the membrane structure. And now the structure of the mitochondria, the cellular powerhouse, becomes very susceptible to damage and easily destroyed. And then you start to lose energy production and things down these lines. So something to keep in mind is that the amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the membranes are controlled within a specific range by the cells themselves. But ideally, we want them on the lower end of the range. And things that can adjust this is the amount of these polyunsaturated fatty acids that we're taking into the diet on a regular basis. And so we want to minimize that intake to the target that I tend to shoot for around is 4 grams per 2,000 calories per day, trying to keep them as low as possible. And I try to maintain a ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 at least around 3-to-1, omega-6 to omega-3. And that's due to some of the inflammatory pathways, the eicosanoid production from the enzyme cyclooxygenase, lipoxygenase, which we'll talk about in a separate video, even in another section we talk about inflammation. But in general, keeping polyunsaturated fatty acids low in the diet seems to be a way to actually improve longevity, at least theoretically, in these different models. Now, the next one I want to talk about, the next category here is going to be nutrient repletion. So we want to make sure that we are replete with all of the necessary micronutrients that we need so that our cells can function appropriately. We also want to be replete with macronutrients, protein, carbs, and fat. So we have enough protein for our structural components, and we have enough fuel sources to minimize stress, and we'll dive into stress as well. But when we look at aging and we look at disease processes, we see things like high amounts of oxidative stress. So how can we manage these? We manage these with having adequate vitamin E, adequate vitamin C. We manage these with adequate protein, the amino acids, glutamate, cysteine, and glycine, so we can produce glutathione. We also manage this with adequate minerals. For example, selenium to produce enzymes like the glutathione-based enzymes. We look at manganese, we look at copper, we look at iron to produce some of the enzymes that require heme in the mitochondria, or the catalase, or the superoxide dismutase, or the thioredoxins, these different enzymes that require these metals, these minerals to function appropriately. And we also look at adequate vitamins. We want to have some of the adequate B vitamins and some of the adequate fat-soluble vitamins that are involved in actually managing oxidative stress, managing immune balance, and protecting us from the processes of aging. So we want to make sure that we are replete in these things. We also want to make sure that we don't have an excess of some of these things that can be problematic, like excessive amounts of iron can be problematic and are involved in a variety of disease processes through iron overload. We also can get too much of certain components in the diet, like you can get excessive amounts of vitamin A that could be problematic. You can also get excessive amounts of certain minerals like selenium and excessive amounts of certain minerals like manganese that can also cause problems. So we want to make sure that we have the Goldilocks zone of these things. We're replete in these things, but we're not at a toxicity level. Other examples we can look at certain disease processes, and certain like cardiovascular disease, which the cardiovascular system is the way we're transporting nutrients to our tissues. If we don't have adequate amounts of things like vitamin C and copper, we can't maintain that collagenous structure. And this goes in line with Dr. Linus Pauling's hypothesis on heart disease of being a subclinical vitamin C deficiency over time. So we make sure we have adequate amounts of these things, we can maintain our vascular system, which is extremely important because our vascular system, again, is transporting nutrients, oxygen, and different components to our cells so that they can function appropriately. So even if all of your peripheral cells are healthy, if you corrupt your vascular system, then the cells will eventually become problematic through ischemia and hypoxia, lack of blood supply, lack of oxygen supply. And whether they're like fully functional or not doesn't matter anymore because they don't have the resources to maintain that function. So we really want to make sure our vascular function is ideal overall. Other components to look at as well is when we talk about bone mass and muscle mass, we want to make sure we have adequate vitamin D, K, calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus in the raw materials to actually maintain our bone structure as we age. And then even the raw materials for muscle, like protein, particularly older people require higher amounts of protein to maintain this anabolic state, or at least minimize the catabolic state, the breakdown of this muscle tissue. Now, the next strategy we have here is minimizing stress hormones. And so there's a variety of stress hormones. We have parathyroid hormone, which is involved in calcium regulation. We have the RAS system, which is involved in sodium, potassium regulation. We have cortisol, glucagon, adrenaline, and growth hormone, which are involved in energy metabolism. And we also have things like prolactin, which are involved in a variety of different stresses, and antidiuretic hormone, which is involved in osmoregulation and fluid stress. So we want to make sure that we have enough calcium, we have enough potassium and balance of potassium and sodium, we have enough carbohydrate, we have enough protein, we have enough fat inside our diet so we don't have to rely on these hormones, because the job of these hormones is to break down our stores and our tissues, break down our structure when we don't have adequate of these components available to actually provide our body with those components from our stores. So we want to avoid breaking down our stores. We want to avoid cannibalizing ourselves under stressful circumstances so that we're able to maintain that structure and then maintain that energy production, because functioning through the general idea of Dr. Pete's hypothesis, energy and structure are interdependent at every level. The other thing to consider is these different stress hormones, the angiotensin 2 in the RAS system, endothelin 1 involved in the RAS system, parathyroid hormone, adrenaline, cortisol, noradrenaline. These components have direct negative effects on mitochondrial function, especially if they are chronically elevated. In short-term situations, in short-term increases to deal with an acute stress, the mitochondria in the system seems to be able to handle those things fine. However, chronic elevation corrupts the vasculature, corrupts the muscle tissue, corrupts the brain tissue, corrupts mitochondrial function. So we don't want to drive these components. And a variety of components of aging, like what we see, sagging skin, loss of memory, loss of muscle tissue, fat tissue being stored centrally in the abdomen, can actually be induced in young people, giving them these hormones. So if you were to give a young person synthetic glucocorticoid-based drugs, you can induce the state of aging and chronic disease directly. So you can induce diabetes, fatty liver, central adiposity, sarcopenia, and things like this with these drugs, immune suppression. So we want to minimize these stress hormones over the course of our lifespan, because I think they are directly involved in aging. I think serotonin peripherally especially is also another one, directly lowering the metabolic rate and signaling a state of torpor, or a lowering of metabolism and an impairment of functions over time because we don't have adequate energy availability. Now, another thing to keep in mind is these stress hormones are also triggered by our environmental circumstances and external pressures and stresses. So what we want to do is we want to make sure, again, that our mindset and our skill sets and our abilities are strong to cope with these external stressors. And then we also have the resources in terms of our diet, in terms of our micronutrients and whatnot, to deal with the stressors when they come. And then we also allow ourselves to recover from them effectively. And I think this goes a long way in the aging process. And I also think it's why you see people who live to old ages with good health, you tend to see there's a certain personality type and a certain way of dealing with stress in these individuals. They've developed appropriate coping mechanisms that I think have been able to help them keep stress low over the course of their life, as well as maybe they have adopted some dietary strategies. Like, for example, the lady Jean Calment, the French lady, she lived to 122 years old, if I remember correctly. One of her favorite dietary components was chocolate, which has a variety of vitamins and minerals. a variety of polyphenolic compounds, and also a variety of saturated fat sources, and particularly a special saturated fatty acid called stearic acid that has beneficial effects on the lipid profile as well as on the mitochondrial function. So these are interesting things to keep in mind. Now, the next category I want to talk about here is the glycine to methionine ratio. And the glycine to methionine ratio is a ratio of the intake of glycine to methionine in the diet. Now, in animal studies, what we see is if you take animals and you restrict their methionine levels, you can actually increase their lifespan pretty considerably. Problem is, there's some side effects that come with that, like alterations in growth, so height and body weight and liver function, things like this, because methionine is essential for these processes. So I think a better strategy to avoid minimizing how tall you are, minimizing your muscle mass, and adjusting liver function is to have adequate glycine on board and ratio to methionine. The glycine target I shoot for is about 0.2 grams per kilogram of glycine per day. And then I try to make sure that I get for every gram of methionine I have in the diet, I add another gram of glycine so that there's an abundance of glycine to manage what's going on with methionine in the body. And there's also adequate amount of glycine to maintain structure because it's extremely important in collagen synthesis and connective tissue structures, which a large portion of our body are composed of these different components. So glycine to methionine ratio, very easy one to dial in. You can do this with collagen hydrolysate in the diet, put a little bit in your coffee. You can also take glycine. It's very sweet. It can sweeten coffee. It can also be used at night to help with sleep. It can help to improve or help you to sleep at night or improve the taste of a tea at night, like a chamomile tea. So a lot of time with clients, I'll have them incorporate some glycine powder in combination with something like taurine in their tea to help them sleep. And also there's a variety of metabolic benefits. Now, the next one I want to talk about, the next category, is inflammation. So we want to keep inflammation low over the course of our lifespan in order to at least maintain our health span. The reason why I say this is inflammation is directly involved in in every disease process, in every chronic disease process. And inflammation can be caused by a variety of different things. And a lot of times it's triggered by immune activation, which is reliant upon stuff going on in the diet, micronutrient deficiencies, damage to mitochondria, excessive stress hormones, endotoxin coming in from the gut, and then different toxic compounds like pollutants, radiation, heavy metal exposure, plasticizers, pesticides, etc. So we want to minimize these inflammatory stimuli. Also, injuries are a huge component of inflammation. So as I talked about, people getting injured in things in the ICU drastically increase inflammation for a period of time and can make it very difficult to recover and can set up a cascade of issues down the line. Now, is modern medicine able to save many of these people's lives? Yes. But then the problem is after that, once their life has been saved, what happens to the quality? What happens to the recovery after that? How are these people recovering? Will they reach optimal health again? Or will they live their lives with impairments after these different things have occurred to them? So we want to minimize inflammation. So that's minimizing injury, minimizing toxicity, minimizing endotoxin, minimizing stress and the stress hormones, and then also incorporating things in our diet and our lifestyle that can help to block the inflammatory stimuli. So as an example, we have something like the plant compounds. There's a variety of plant compounds. All of them modulate the microbiome, and they all seem to block or modulate inflammatory pathways in a beneficial way. So incorporating these different plant compounds, particularly from things like fruits and vegetables, seem to be very helpful in maintaining health over the long term. And we see tons and tons of studies and research, epidemiologic studies, animal studies, direct intervention studies showing these plant compounds lowering inflammation and improving health over time. So we want to incorporate these things. Another option, I'm not saying people should use this or take this, but we just as an example to show is aspirin is a direct anti-inflammatory agent. It blocks the enzyme cyclooxygenase that takes the polyunsaturated fatty acids and converts them into inflammatory mediators. And we see that aspirin has been associated with lowering cancer pretty significantly, multiple types of cancer, and also has been used to prevent cardiovascular disease, which I think are two of the major diseases right now that are claiming the lives of millions and millions of people inside Western nations, these chronic disease processes. So aspirin, as an example, blocking inflammation, seems to have benefits in these different disease processes that may improve lifespan, health span, etc. Second to last category I want to talk about is the microbiome and endotoxemia and bacterial toxins coming from the intestine. Now, there's some interesting studies. Dr. Pete has mentioned these where there was a researcher who gave piglets or pigs charcoal and extended their lifespan. I think the benefit of this is through binding up endotoxin. Now, there's not direct studies that I could specifically find where lowering endotoxin in general actually directly improve lifespan, but the endotoxin and bacterial metabolites and toxins from the intestine are strongly involved in almost every single disease process, and they have direct negative effects on the hormonal systems, on the immune system, on the mitochondria, and on a variety of different processes in the body. So I think minimizing these and making sure that the microbiome is optimized over the lifespan can actually drastically improve health span and also lifespan by minimizing the formation of cardiovascular disease, of metabolic dysfunction, of autoimmunity, cancer, etc., where we see endotoxins a major player in all of these different areas. And so this will involve setting up the diet appropriately, making sure you have adequate plant compounds and foods that you specifically tolerate in your diet to minimize these problems. And so this is another, again, it comes down to setting up the diet. The diet is absolutely key, as well as some of the other lifestyle components. Stress can impair microbiome. Excessive exercise can damage microbiome. Circadian disruption can alter the microbiome. And nutrient deficiencies can also alter the microbiome. So we want to make sure that these things are dialed in, and we're also making sure the microbiome is organized. Now, the last one here, the 10th category is toxicity. So a variety of toxins, heavy metals, exhaust, radiation, pollutants, pesticides can all directly damage mitochondrial energy function, general cellular function, and lead to a variety of the different diseases, whether that's cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurodegeneration, autoimmune disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to minimize these in our lifestyle and our diet. We want to get the highest quality food we can. We want good air quality. We want to minimize things that may be possibly problematic, like excessive exposure to radiation, whether that's getting tons of CT scans or X-rays in your life, or having a high exposure to, for example, non-native EMF, like being on the phone all day long, having it close to your head or to your ears, or sleeping next to Wi-Fi routers, all these different options. Or we want to minimize excessive exposure to plasticizers as best as possible. We want to have high quality water that doesn't have heavy metal content, radioactive content. We want to make sure our food is organic, not rich in problematic pesticides. So all of these things are extremely important in longevity and in maintaining health span, because each of these components directly damages functions that allow us to live a long and healthy life. So with that said, these are the top 10 strategies that I am currently looking at and implementing in my life, that I'm discussing with clients in terms of improving health span and improving lifespan. Obviously, this is a work in progress. I'm continuing to learn and incorporate more components and adjust these components, tweak them, make them better, figure out which ones are the highest value available. And I'm coming at this from the perspective of reasonable strategies that I can manipulate and adjust in my lifestyle to have these effects. I'm trying not to rely heavily on super expensive or entailing regimens that then decrease the quality of my life because of the amount of time expenditure and amount of energy that I have to put in these things that may be unenjoyable, like at least for me, going and sitting in ice cold baths or taking semi-problematic drugs. So these are the strategies that I put in place. There's obviously other strategies that can be incorporated. You have to figure out which ones work for you. I will break down other strategies inside other videos. I'll talk about some of the strategies being used by people like Brian Johnson, go through some of the research on them, make videos on that. So if there's certain strategies that you would like me to go over or discuss, you can put them in the comments. And with that said, I will catch you in the next video.